Bible reading this morning is from Joshua chapter 24, and it's in two sections, verses 1 and 2, and then from 14 to 25. Chapter 24. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Then the people answered, Far be it from us to forsake the Lord, to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us from on our entire journey, and among all the nations through which we travelled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites, who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord, because he is our God. Joshua said to the people, You are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive you your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said to Joshua, No, we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said, You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you, and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, We will serve the Lord our God and obey him. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws.
Morning. When Jesus was asked about what is the greatest commandment, what does God expect or require of us? His answer was that we are to deeply love, to be fully devoted to, and to serve sacrificially both God and other people. And he further went on to say that to do this well, to do this fully, requires heart, soul, mind, and strength. What Jesus was saying here is that to follow in his way requires physical health, mental health, emotional and social health, and also spiritual health. And if we at Hughes Baptist are to be spiritually healthy community, we must grow together in that spiritual health and maturity. We must be building each other up and encouraging one another. Daniel Goleman first popularised the emerging field in psychology called emotional intelligence in the 1990s. And more recent work now refers to this as emotional and social intelligence. The four domains are arranged in a grid with columns for self and others, and rows for awareness and regulation or control. Now, I believe that spiritual intelligence or spiritual health, spiritual maturity, is closely aligned to emotional maturity, as witnessed in the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. We see the 9 fruits of the Spirits, particularly self-control, gentleness in times of anxiety, patience. We can't be spiritually healthy unless we're emotionally healthy. And I think that spiritual health completes the rather secular emotional and social components of self and others by adding a dimension for the divine. If we're to be a spiritually healthy community, we need to be emotionally healthy and mature in our interactions. And a key marker of emotional and spiritual health is how we manage the ambiguities, the contradictions, the paradoxes, the tensions that we come across in life. What I'm calling this morning the polarities. What do I mean by polarities? Well, an obvious one is the work-life balance. Imagine someone in mid-career. A lot of pressures at work, they're seeking the next promotion, they've got a young family at home. Juggling life can be difficult, torn in two different directions. And you don't even have to have kids at home to have a work-life balance problem. In organisations, the classical polarity is a tug between systems and processes and procedures and everyone on the same page, and wanting creativity and innovation and individual initiative. For leaders, one of the key polarities is that between understanding reality and what's going wrong and how the world is working and what the environment your organisation is in, versus having a vision for how it should and could be. There's a tug between that. Which is more important at the moment? For Christians, that same dimension comes into play in our understanding of the kingdom of God. That it's now, but it's not yet. It's not yet fully realised. We're in the world, but we're not to be of the world. Doctrinally, we have some difficult concepts. That God is three and that God is one. That Jesus is fully human, but fully divine. How do we tussle with that? So, also, as a community, we're to focus partly on fellowship and discipleship and building each other up. But we're also to be outwardly focused in social justice and evangelism. There are so many matters that can be polarising within our community. Things where there are limited resources, competing priorities, passionate beliefs, and alternative interpretations of Scripture. Now, divisions between groups of people is nothing new. Some of you have loyalties to particular sporting teams and hate those other teams with a passion, right? You ever heard the expression, I support X, but I also support any team that's playing Y? Right? And we can be divided over politics, political alliances. Some of us wear these identities proudly in the form of sporting jerseys. If you look at Parliament, you'll see red ties to the left of politics and more blue ties to the right of politics. The issue for the church is how we value our diversity. How can we get past these differences and embrace one another? Even more, esteem one another as siblings in the Lord. Today I want to open a discussion on how we can do the hard stuff of living together as a single and diverse community. Our theme for the following month is the topic of polarities. I could have called this crucial conversations or difficult doctrines, but the underlying problem is polarity. So we're going to look at the issue of polarities over the next 5 weeks. In a recent book called The Righteous Mind, psychologist Jonathan Haidt talks about why good people are divided by politics and religion. It's been known for some time that our emotional response to people and to situations can trigger extremely quickly. The amygdala in the centre of the brain has ready access to our past hurts, our emotional biases, our cultural upbringing, our ingrained values, what we want to passionately pursue and what we want to passionately avoid. Those triggers that we have, or those aversions. And this rapid emotional response is good. It tells us when to be on our guard, and it senses potential danger. Now, our rational frontal cortex takes a little bit longer to respond. And the key thesis in this book is that most of the time our rational mind spends its time and its energy not overturning or fully reviewing the initial emotional response, but rather it seems wholly occupied with a rational justification of a not very well thought through emotional response. That's human nature. We want to justify the decision we've already just made. So our rationality becomes subservient to our emotions rather than the other way around. We like to think that we're rational beings, but most of the time we're emotional beings. Now the result of this, one of the results of this, is that sometimes when we're talking to people, if someone who's not from our camp is talking to us, we subconsciously switch off. We stop processing what they're saying. In effect, we're metaphorically going, la 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 la. I hope you realise that wasn't a mature response. Okay? Even if you just did it in your head. So my point is that life entails ambiguities and tensions, what I'm calling polarities. They're part of everyday life for all humans. And good people are inevitably get divided over things that they're passionate about. Now, over the next 5 weeks, we're going to explore 5 different polarities in the life of the Christian church. And more importantly, I want to offer 4 strategies for how to deal with these kinds of polarities. So I want to quickly look at the 4 strategies. The first approach we have to polarities is to pick a comfort spot where we think we should sit on that spectrum from one end to the other. This is a position often of moderation. This is a basic approach that we've all learnt at some stage. When we've got competing priorities, we tend to compromise. We tend to find a spot where we're happy in the middle. Now, I used to think that this was the golden rule. Moderation in all things. My brother would add, including moderation. But there are much better ways of dealing with most polarities. There's a few that fit with this, and we'll see one of them later on. And I have to say, before I leave this, we have to remember the Baptist tenet of freedom of conscience and soul liberty. You might be sitting on one position here, and others might be sitting somewhere else. We need to respect that person's position. In fact, we need to go more than that. We need to do our best to understand why they're there and we're here. But let's look at some other approaches to polarities. In the mid-1970s, a guy called Barry Johnson developed what he called polarity management. It's more typically just called the infinity loop. The idea here is there needs to be movement. We don't just have one fixed position, that we're able to be flexible. And sometimes in seasons or circumstances, we can move a little bit one way or the other. Often in a regular rhythm. Sometimes small movements are all that's needed to keep agile and nimble. Sometimes you need bigger movements. For example, if we were to look at the cycle of Sabbath. Play hard, work hard. Go to each end, because each end's a good place to be. But do it in a cycle. Don't stay at one end long term. Now, Barry's idea was that if you went too far on a spectrum and stayed too long at one end, over time problems would start to happen for you. So, for example, in an organisation, if you move to freedom and flexibility and innovation, it's great for a while. You're discovering new ways of doing things. It can be exciting. If you stay at that end of the spectrum for a long time, though, everybody starts doing their own thing and the whole thing is chaotic. There's no control. Now it's attractive to go back the other way. Put a few rules and procedures in place. Have some systems so everyone's on the same page. But if you stay down that end too long, you begin to stagnate as an organisation. And so you need to move back to innovation and discovery again. And that's the idea of this infinity loop. It's well documented. It's interesting reading. I think an even more mature approach is needed for some polarities. Stop seeing the problem as a tension of either or. I've got to do this or I've got to do that, and I can only do one at the same time. Try to find the synergy. Try to find how you can grasp both ends and hang on to the tension. Both ends are good things to do. Both ends are good and true. Hang on to both and live in that tension. There's lots of doctrinal issues that are best dealt with this way. And we'll look at one next week. Understanding Jesus as being fully human and fully divine. Not a wishy-washy little bit of each, but fully both. It's a difficult doctrine, but we need to hang on to both ends and live in the tension. Now, the fourth approach, a few polarities can be dealt with this way. Understand they're not polarities at all. We've artificially connected the two things, and so what we need to do is reframe the issue, break the nexus, break the connection between them, and live both principles as best we can. We'll see one of those in our series as well. Now, in the time remaining this morning, I wish to apply all of this theory to a basic, classic split in the Protestant church. This is the polarity over predestination versus free will, often called the Calvinist-Arminian debate, based on the ideas of John Calvin, one of the prime movers in the Protestant Reformation, and a less-known figure, Jacobus Arminius. The debate centres over the nature of salvation. It involves concepts around the total depravity of human nature and the atonement that was made possible through Jesus' death on the cross. In its current form, this debate has been around since the 17th century. But actually it goes back much earlier. Augustine debated exactly these same questions with the Pelagians in the 5th century. So this debate's been around for a very long time, and it's still alive today. On a recent study tour with Moreland College, one of my colleagues joined me at my seat on the bus and started a conversation getting to know who I was. And one of the very first questions he asked me was I Calvinist or Arminian? What? Is that the first thing you want to know about me? To put me in a box? I was gobsmacked. This debate's still around. Now, I have to look back in hindsight and say I probably didn't handle that very well. I could have been a bit gentler with the guy, but basically bit his head off and told him I was both because the Bible teaches both. But let's look at the issue. Let's look at this polarity briefly this morning. One end of the spectrum, predestination, is about the divine sovereignty, the sovereignty of God. So there's a few passages, particularly in the NIV, that the idea of predestination comes out very clearly. Ephesians 1:4, for he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. He chose you before you were formed, before even the world was formed. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. One of the greatest verses in the Bible, according to Glendan Krause, is Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We often look at that verse in isolation, but the word called is actually referring to predestination. Have a look at the very next verse. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn, that is, Jesus might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters, you and I. And those he predestined, He called, and those he called he justified, and those he justified he glorified. The other end of this spectrum is often labelled free will. That is a mistake. It's a misnomer. We don't have free will. The Bible teaches us that our wills are clogged up with sin. But what we do have is choices to make in life, and we are held accountable for those choices. We're urged throughout the Bible to make wise choices. In our reading this morning, Joshua was pressing with the people to choose wisely and to understand the choice they were making. There's a sense here that there is a human will or a determination, or the correct term is volition. We have volition to choose to do what we want to. Some of the other verses in the Bible that hint at this, there's no verse in the Bible that talks directly about free will, but in terms of choices and volition, we have James 1, verse 21 and 22. Therefore get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. And Romans 8:9. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe with your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. This is the same writer that 2 chapters earlier said God predestined us. He's now saying it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. How do we line those two things up? The most well-known verse in the Bible, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish. And finally, Revelation. Jesus himself said, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in. I won't come in if the door stays closed. You have to open the door. But then I will come in and eat with that person and they with me." There isn't one single person who's disqualified from the love of God if only they would choose him. Now, one of the classic examples in the Old Testament of this dilemma occurs when we hear the story of the Exodus and the 10 plagues. Who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Most of us think it was God. Actually, we need to read these verses very carefully, because in the first half of the narrative, up until the 5th plague, the narrative says that Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then from plague 6 onwards, it's very clear that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So these verses here refer to plagues 2, the frogs, and 5, livestock. So up until plague 5, it's Pharaoh doing this. But from plague 6 on, God's saying, okay, time's up. I'm locking this in. I'm hardening your heart now. You won't change your mind. I'm done. So, this dilemma of predestination and free will, it's really about the utter sovereignty of God and the personal accountability we have for our choices and for our sin. Let me put it to you in a modern parable. A child, a toddler, and a parent go out into the garden to plant a vegetable garden. And the parent digs a hole and puts the first seedling in and does the second one and then helps the child do the next couple. And at some point, that kid looks up at their parent and says, "I want to do it for mine own self." And so the parent says, "Okay, here's the trowel, dig a little hole, take a seedling." Oh, snapped off the seedling. Oh, that's no good. We'll grab another one, put it in. It's a bit crooked. Maybe it'll grow, maybe it won't. But they plant out a vegetable garden together. Who did the planting? Who's responsible for the neatness of the rows and the growth of the plants? Was it the child? Was it the parent? Now, this may be not the best metaphor, but God is the parent, we're the child in this story. God, there's a huge difference between God and us. God's ability, God's sovereignty, God's power, and us. But somehow his sovereignty does not overwhelm our volition and our choices. I can't explain it any better than that. So how do we resolve this polarity? I've given you some strategies. How does that work in this particular case? Well, I suggest if you stick with the old classic predestination and free will as the description of the polarity, then you're stuck with picking a position. But be careful where you choose. If you go way to one end, I'm looking at the screen the other way. If you go way to this end, predestination, you become an ultra-Calvinist. And by the way, Calvin was not a Calvinist. That's just to confuse you. But if you went ultra-Calvinist, you believe that every choice has already been made by God. He's in control. All the saved are already determined. You don't have to do any evangelism. You don't even have to live a good life. If you go too far down this end, God set the whole thing up. Jesus died on the cross, all that, yeah. But all I have to do is accept it. It's up to me. You ignore the fact that it needs God working within you to change your lifestyle and who you are. So in this particular polarity, the extremes are not good places to be. Sitting in the middle, wishy-washy halfway really doesn't work either. So if you want to pick a spot, you've got to be moderately left or moderately right, which is what my friend on the bus was asking me. Was I moderately Calvinist or moderately Arminian? You could reframe it a little bit. Think about it differently. There are times and seasons and situations where you have to let God be God. Back off. Let God do his work. Only God is going to change a human heart. But there are circumstances where you're asked to step up. Say a kind word. Have a deep conversation with a colleague at work. You're asked to participate with God in his work that only he can do. The other way to manage this polarity is to see it simply as a matter of divine sovereignty. Yes, I believe that. And human accountability. Yes, I believe that. And I'm going to hang on to both and I'm going to live in that tension. I won't go to the fourth one. We'll talk about that another time. So that's my take on predestination and free will. And as the music team come up for our final song, I want to leave you with some homework. Think about Paul on the road to Damascus. If God had revealed himself directly to Paul, as he told Moses was too hard for Moses to handle, if he did that, please, music team, come up. Was there any choice for Paul left in the situation? Perhaps you see it that Paul was already zealous for God and just needed a little nudge, a correction in the right direction. But how was Paul's volition involved in that experience? Have a think about that this week, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers.